Ava Collins didn't walk into St. Gabriel looking for a fight. She just wanted to do her job, help people, save lives, prove that all the years of hard work had been worth it. But hospitals, like any institution, had unspoken rules. And from the moment she stepped onto the floor, she could tell. This place had already decided who belonged and who didn't. It started small, the kind of cold politeness that masked something uglier. Conversations that paused the second she walked past. Sideways glances exchanged between nurses. A clipboard shoved toward her with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile. She'd seen this before. She knew what it meant. Then came the real test. Dr. Victor Graves, head of the department, well-respected, the kind of man whose words carried weight, stopped her in the hallway. He didn't bother with introductions. "I assume you know what you're doing," he said, like it was already up for debate. "We have high standards here. I hope you're prepared to meet them." Ava nodded, because that's what you did. You nodded, you worked, and you proved yourself. But proving herself wasn't the problem. The problem was, they didn't want her to succeed. It was in the way the schedules were written, the way she got the toughest patients, the heaviest caseloads, the shifts no one else wanted. The way her mistakes, real or imagined, were scrutinized while others were given the benefit of the doubt. It was a system designed to wear her down. And maybe in another lifetime, it would have worked. But Ava had spent too long fighting to get here. She wasn't about to let them break her. So she worked. Harder, faster, sharper. She learned the hospital's rhythms, the places where the pressure built up, the gaps in coverage that no one talked about. And she made herself indispensable, because if they were going to push her twice as hard, she was going to make sure they had no choice but to respect her. She just hadn't expected him. Room 412. The name on the chart made her pause. Snoop Dogg. It had to be a joke, but no. The Snoop Dogg, which explained why the hospital was buzzing. Staff moving a little too fast, whispering a little too much. Because sure, celebrities came through St. Gabriel now and then, but this was different. And that meant rules were different too. Some patients demanded attention, some were ignored. And then there were the ones like him, the kind that made people nervous, the kind that forced people to pretend they weren't staring. Ava didn't care about any of that. She had a job to do. So she pushed open the door, clipboard in hand, and met his gaze for the first time. He didn't say anything, just watched. Most patients asked questions. They wanted reassurance, information, something to distract them from the fact that they were stuck in a hospital bed. Snoop just watched. Ava gave him the usual rundown, medications, vitals, what to expect over the next few days. He nodded occasionally, like he was filing it all away. Like this wasn't his first time seeing how a place like this operated. And maybe it wasn't. Maybe that's why when Ava turned to leave, she heard him say, almost absently, "Rough gig, huh?" She didn't answer, because what was there to say? She had no idea that the next few days would change everything. That the quiet man in room 412 had already seen enough to start putting the pieces together. That while she was fighting to prove herself, he was watching. And he wasn't the kind of man who just watched without doing something about it. Ava didn't have time to think about Snoop Dogg. She barely had time to think at all. The workload had doubled overnight. No explanation, no warning. Just an updated schedule with her name stamped across the hardest assignments. Patients no one else wanted, the ones who yelled, refused treatment, made life miserable for the staff. She handled it. She always handled it. But the unspoken part, the real part, wasn't in the work itself. It was in the way they watched. Dr. Graves, the senior nurses, the ones who made the rules without ever having to say them out loud. They were waiting for her to fail, hoping for it. And when she didn't, they just pushed harder. The mistakes weren't hers, but that didn't matter. The wrong dosage written down by another nurse, the missing supplies that should have been restocked, the delay in a patient's transfer because the transport team was late. Every time something went wrong, the blame landed in her lap. She didn't argue. She just worked. Snoop Dogg watched, not in the casual way most patients did, not out of boredom or curiosity. He was paying attention, really paying attention, like he was waiting for something. Maybe that's why, when she walked into his room at the end of a brutal shift, he spoke first. "Let me guess," he said. "They got you running all the worst cases." She glanced at his chart, pretending to be busy. He didn't need an answer. Figured, he said. It's how they test people, see what they're made of. She didn't respond, because it wasn't a test. Not really. Tests had rules, a way to pass or fail. This wasn't that. This was something uglier. And Snoop? He knew it. His room was different from the others. Patients with his kind of name, his kind of reputation, got special treatment. But he didn't act like it, didn't demand extra attention, didn't make requests. He just listened. Ava had learned to keep her head down, to focus on the work. But after a few days, she realized something strange. She wasn't just watching him. He was watching them. The doctors, the administrators, the way people talked when they thought no one important was around. He paid attention the same way she did, with the kind of awareness that came from experience. And when Dr. Graves came to check on him, she saw it for what it was. The act. Graves, the same man who barely acknowledged her existence, turned on the charm. The voice was warmer, the body language relaxed, like they were old friends. It was all a performance, every carefully chosen word, every measured pause. Snoop let him talk, let him pretend. Then, when Graves finally left, he glanced at Ava. You ever notice how people talk different when they think someone matters? She had. It was the same way Graves spoke to the board members, the donors, the people with enough power to make his life easier or harder. The difference now? Snoop Dogg wasn't just a patient. He was someone they were afraid to disappoint. The shift was subtle, but it was there. A hesitation in the way the nurses glanced at him, a new edge in Graves's voice. Because whatever they thought of Ava, they knew he was watching. And for the first time since she walked through the doors of St. Gabriel, she wasn't the only one paying attention. Ava didn't expect anything to change. Hospitals didn't work like that. You put your head down, did the job, and hoped the system didn't crush you in the process. But something had changed. Snoop Dogg wasn't just watching anymore. He was taking notes. He asked questions, not just about his treatment, but about everything. Who made decisions? Who actually ran things? How long certain people had worked there? He wasn't interested in the answers themselves, but in the way people answered. Because people lied. Not the obvious kind, not outright. It was in the small things, the hesitations, the shifting excuses, the way someone's voice changed when they were covering something up. Ava had spent years learning how to read those signs. Snoop had spent decades. The more he saw, the less he talked. The less he talked, the more nervous people got. And suddenly, Ava wasn't invisible anymore. It wasn't a good thing. Whispers that had been kept to the corners were now out in the open. Looks of quiet disapproval turned into something sharper. Graves didn't hide his irritation anymore. He pushed harder, loaded her up with more patients, pulled her into his office for performance evaluations that were just thinly veiled warnings. But the worst of it wasn't the work. It was the way people started keeping their distance. Before, they had ignored her. Now, they were avoiding her. And she knew why. No one wanted to be caught standing next to the problem. The thing about power was that it didn't need to say much. It just needed to make people choose. And no one was choosing Ava, except for one person. You ever thought about quitting? It was the first time Snoop had asked her anything personal. He was sitting up now, moving better, getting stronger. The nurses still treated him carefully, but Ava had a feeling it wasn't just because of his injuries anymore. No, she said. It wasn't a lie. She had wanted to quit, but wanting and deciding were two different things. Why not? Ava thought about that, thought about how easy it would be to walk away, to go somewhere else, start over. But that wasn't the point. They don't want me here, she said finally. That's why I stay. Snoop nodded, like he already knew that would be her answer. Good, he said. I was hoping you'd say that. The next morning, everything cracked wide open. It started with a surgery, a big one, high risk, the kind of procedure that made headlines. Dr. Graves was leading it. Ava was supposed to be on a different rotation, but at the last minute, her name got added to the team. No reason given, no explanation, just a printed schedule taped to the board like it had always been there. She knew what it was. Another test, another trap. Graves wanted her to make a mistake, and if she didn't, he'd make it look like she did. She scrubbed in anyway, because that's what you did. The operation started smoothly. Ava moved through the steps, did everything exactly right, but halfway through, something shifted. Graves hesitated. It was small, barely noticeable, the kind of thing only someone who had been watching him for weeks would see. But Ava saw it, and so did Snoop, because the patient was one of his. Not a celebrity, not someone rich, just a guy from back home. Someone Snoop had been looking out for, had helped get back on his feet. A nobody by the hospital's standards, but not to him. And Graves was about to mess up. Ava opened her mouth before she could stop herself. Wait, the whole room stopped. Graves didn't move. Ava pointed at the screen, at the way he was positioning the incision, at the tiny, almost imperceptible mistake he was about to make. The kind of mistake that could kill someone. Graves's eyes flicked to her, and in that moment, she knew. He'd already realized, he'd known before she even spoke, and he hadn't planned on stopping, because some patients mattered, and some didn't. The silence stretched. Then, after a long, slow moment, he changed his angle. The surgery continued. The patient survived, and Ava had just done the one thing no one ever did. She made Graves back down. Which meant she had made an enemy. Ava knew it was coming. The moment the surgery ended, she felt it. The weight of something shifting, the quiet tightening of an invisible noose. Graves didn't yell. He didn't explode. That wasn't his style. No. Men like him didn't get even. They erased you. And the process started immediately. Her name disappeared from schedules. Critical assignments that had been hers were reassigned to others. The cases she had been handling, the hardest ones, the ones no one else wanted, were suddenly too important for someone still proving themselves. When she walked into the nurse's station, conversations stopped. People who used to nod at her in passing now looked away. It was happening faster than she thought, which meant Graves had been waiting for this moment. He didn't need to fire her. That wasn't how you got rid of people like Ava. You made them quit. You isolated them. You undermined them. You made it impossible for them to function until walking away was the only option left. It was a game she had seen before, and if she were alone, maybe she would have played by the rules. But she wasn't alone. Snoop was still watching, and when she stepped into his room that afternoon, he was already waiting. "How bad?" he asked. No preamble, no small talk. Ava exhaled. "Bad." Snoop nodded like he expected that answer. Like he had seen it play out before, maybe in a different setting, under different lights, but with the same players. "They gonna make you walk?" he asked. She didn't answer, because she didn't know. She wanted to say no, wanted to believe she was strong enough to outlast them, but there was a limit to how long you could fight a system that didn't want you there. Snoop studied her for a long time. Then casually, like it was nothing, he said, "Tell me about Graves." She frowned. "What about him?" "Everything." Ava hesitated, not because she didn't want to talk, but because no one had ever asked. She told him about the little things first. The schedule changes, the extra workload, the way Graves had always positioned himself as an obstacle rather than a leader. She told him about the way he spoke to her. Not cruel, not openly hostile, but with the kind of detached indifference that let you know exactly where you stood. Then she told him about the surgery. How Graves had hesitated. How he had been willing to risk a man's life. How she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that if she hadn't spoken up, they'd be planning a funeral. Snoop listened without interrupting. Then he asked one final question. "If that had been me on the table, you think he would have hesitated?" Ava didn't answer, because they both knew the answer. The next morning, Graves called her into his office. He was calm, measured. His voice was polite, the way someone speaks when they're offering you a way out. "Maybe this isn't the right place for you," he said. Ava kept her hands still. "I've seen this happen before," he continued. "Some people just aren't a good fit. Nothing personal. It's just the way things work out." She could hear it beneath his words. "Leave now, and I won't make this worse for you." Ava held his gaze. She could have walked. It would have been easier, safer. But the thing about power, it only works if people play along. So she smiled. "I think I'll stay." Graves' expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did, because he understood what she meant. He couldn't get rid of her that easily. The meeting ended, and outside, just down the hall, Snoop Dogg was waiting. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He just smiled, because the game had changed, and Graves wasn't the only one holding the cards anymore. Ava knew the second she walked out of Graves' office that things were about to get worse. not in a loud, dramatic way. That wasn't how men like him operated. He wouldn't yell. He wouldn't fire her. That would be too easy, too obvious. No, Graves would make her disappear. And over the next few days, he tried. Her assignments vanished from the system. The other nurses, some sympathetic, some just scared, suddenly had reasons to be somewhere else when she entered a room. The patients she had built trust with were quietly transferred to different staff. It was textbook, a slow erasure, and it might have worked. But the thing about power, it only works when no one's looking. And Snoop Dogg was looking. He started asking questions, not to Ava, but to everyone else. The kind of casual, innocent questions that made people nervous, that made them wonder. How long's Graves been here? What's his deal? You trust him? Simple, direct, and devastating. Because the second doubt creeps in, control starts slipping. Ava didn't know what Snoop was planning. He didn't say much, just watched, listened, made notes in his head. And then one morning, everything cracked wide open. Graves called for an emergency staff meeting. No warning, no agenda, just a message, mandatory attendance, no exceptions. Ava knew what it was, the final push. If he couldn't make her quit, he'd make an example out of her. The room was packed. Doctors, nurses, administrators, all of them pretending this wasn't exactly what it looked like. Graves stood at the front, calm, collected, the perfect image of authority. Then he started talking. We hold ourselves to a certain standard here at St. Gabriel. The words were polite, but she knew what they meant. There is no room for you here. We rely on teamwork, professionalism, and accountability. You don't belong, which is why it's important to recognize when someone isn't the right fit. You should have walked away when I gave you the chance. Ava kept her expression still. She wasn't stupid. She knew how this worked. If she spoke up, she'd look defensive. If she stayed quiet, she'd look guilty. It wasn't a choice. It was a trap. Then Snoop Dogg stood up, and the whole room went silent. Everyone turned, because this wasn't part of the script. Graves hesitated, just for a second, but long enough. Snoop stretched like he had all the time in the world. Then he looked around the room, taking in every face, every uncomfortable shift. Man, he said finally, voice light, almost amused. This is fascinating. Graves stiffened. Mr. Broaddus, this is a private... Snoop held up a hand. And just like that, Graves shut up, because that's what power actually looks like. Not yelling, not threats, just knowing you don't have to play the game. See, I've been watching, Snoop continued. Real close, and I gotta say, it's been educational. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. No one knew where this was going, except Ava. She knew. Snoop wasn't just here to watch. He was here to burn the whole thing down. I got a question, he said, looking straight at Graves. You keep talking about standards, about who belongs here, who don't. So let me ask you, who decides that? Graves forced a thin smile. The hospital has protocols, Mr. Broaddus. We have? Nah. Snoop shook his head. Not what I asked. Who decides? Graves faltered, because there was no good answer. Because if he said the board, that meant they could be questioned. If he said the administration, that meant they were responsible. If he said himself, well, then he just admitted it was personal. The silence stretched. Snoop leaned back, easy, relaxed, like he had all day. You ever wonder what happens when people start asking the same questions I do? A ripple of unease spread through the room, because they already knew the answer. Graves wasn't untouchable. He'd spent years building an image, crafting his authority so carefully no one dared question it. But the second someone like Snoop Dogg started poking holes in that, it all fell apart. And now everyone was watching. Graves must have realized it, because his expression tightened. This isn't a discussion, he snapped. Snoop smiled, slow, sharp. Sure seems like one. Graves opened his mouth, then stopped, because someone had just walked into the room, the hospital administrator, a man who rarely if ever showed up to staff meetings, and behind him, a legal representative. Graves turned pale, because now, it wasn't just about Ava, it was about him. Snoop tapped his fingers on the table, thoughtful. You know, he mused, I wasn't planning on getting involved, just came here to get better. But then I started noticing things, started hearing things. And I figure if I'm seeing all this in just a few weeks, imagine what's been happening for years. The tension was suffocating. Ava could see it in every face. The dawning realization. This wasn't going away. Graves squared his shoulders, tried to salvage what was left. I don't see how any of this is relevant. The administrator cut him off. We do. 2 words, and just like that, it was over. Ava watched it happen in real time, Graves losing control, the whispers starting, the way people looked at him now. Like he was already gone. Snoop stood, stretched again, and gave Ava a look, a quiet acknowledgement. She had fought alone for too long, but not anymore. And as she walked out of that room, she knew this fight wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. The fallout was immediate. Graves didn't leave right away. People like him never did. They held on, convinced they could fix things, convinced they could control the damage. But this wasn't something he could spin, because once people see the cracks, they don't stop looking. And now, everyone was looking. The investigation moved fast, too fast for Graves to get ahead of it. The complaints started surfacing, formal ones, old ones, the kind that had been ignored, buried, quietly dismissed. Some of them from staff, some from patients. He was given the chance to resign. He didn't take it. So they fired him. No farewell speech, no legacy to preserve, just a name erased from the system, the way he had tried to erase hers. And just like that, he was gone. But this fight had never been about one man. Power didn't disappear just because someone lost their job. It reshaped itself, found new faces to hide behind. Ava knew that. She also knew she wasn't done. So when the hospital approached her, asked her to take on a new role, to help rebuild, to fix what had been broken for so long, she didn't hesitate. She said yes. It wasn't about revenge. That wasn't why she had stayed. It was about making sure no one else had to fight the same battle alone. Snoop left a week later. The nurses threw him a quiet send-off, the kind that only happens when staff actually like a patient. He took pictures, signed a few things, cracked a few jokes, but there was something else in his expression. Something satisfied. Like a man who had done what he came to do. Ava walked him to the exit. He stopped just before stepping through the doors. Wasn't planning on all this, he said. Ava smiled. Neither was I. Snoop nodded, thoughtful. Then, before leaving, he said one last thing. You know, hospitals like this, places like this, they always got someone like Graves, but they also got people like you. And that's the difference. Then he was gone. Ava didn't watch him leave. She turned back toward the hospital, toward everything waiting inside. Because Snoop was right. There would always be another Graves. There would always be another battle. But as long as there were people willing to stand up, to speak up, to hold the line when it mattered most, then maybe, just maybe, the fight was worth it. Thank you for taking the time to experience this story. Some stories are meant to entertain. Others are meant to wake people up. This was one of those stories. It's about resilience, about knowing your worth, even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. About the quiet, steady power of standing your ground, not just for yourself, but for those who come after you. If this story resonated with you, if you saw pieces of yourself in Ava's fight, know this, you are not alone. The world is full of people who refuse to accept less than what they deserve. And that's how change happens. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And most of all, thank you for caring.